Recently, due to pressure from payment processors, Steam has removed several adult games with extreme content. This was not Steam's choice, instead they were pressured by MasterCard and Visa into removing these titles. The reason for this pressure is that a somewhat sexophobic feminist group called Collective Shout contacted these payment processors with a list of the games in question and demanded that they put pressure on Steam to remove them. The thesis of this organization's mission is itself somewhat problematic, not because trying to stop exploitation and abuse is a bad thing, but rather because no one can possibly disagree with the actions of a group that purports to be preventing abuse without themselves seeming morally suspect. And I think the precedent that this campaign sets is very troubling. Of course, almost no one will agree that Steam should be hosting adult games that depict abuse, but that isn't the point. What matters is the appropriations that will be made of these tactics by other groups in order to silence expression and freedom on the internet. In other words, it is the means that is the primary problem. But it is a question of ends also. If you agree with the actions of Collective Shout because they are fighting against something that is antithetical to conservative or family values, or because you think that there should be a serious moral force in society against adult content or sexualization, you are seriously naive. The problem is similar to Alexander Dugin's notion that the left and right are, quote-unquote, united by what they are against and divided by what they are for. The obvious problem is, as Charles Upton wrote, that despite having the same enemies, the left and the right must necessarily be at war with each other. When one side takes power, even if it happens to destroy an object of conservative or leftist hatred, it will result in the ultimate downfall of the other side. We cannot, in reality, be friends, nor can we benefit from each other's exercises of power, even if we might sometimes have similar ends, like the end of liberalism or the suppression of sexuality. What I will explain later about the cause of neocensorship must be understood in the sense that whatever comes after it will necessarily be either left or right wing. It cannot be both, and it stands to reason that it could be just as censorious as liberal capitalism. I made a video on the recent age verification laws quite a while ago, and the point I will make is quite similar. What we are witnessing is the unfolding of a new and distributed form of political control that operates through infrapower and is intrinsically tied up with capitalism. The right is already persona non grata in most places on the internet, and if this horizontal control intensifies, which it will because the precedent has already been set, we will soon find it impossible to have a free political discussion online. What Collective Shout has done to Steam, they can easily do to YouTube or to Facebook, Instagram, even small online forums or websites like Gab. The canary in the coal mine was, of course, Josh from Kiwi Farms. He has faced the same type of horizontal pressure applied to both ISPs and payment processors by those who want to take down the site. He has survived only through using alternative services like cryptocurrency and smaller, more insulated companies or domains hosted in foreign countries that don't care as much about market viability. What happened to Kiwi Farms will happen to us all eventually, to the degree that our values and desires deviate from the norm, whatever that norm is, and whether it's left or right wing. Michel Foucault described this type of control as the panopticon. Disciplinary societies of the past relied on top-down enforcement through violence and domination to control social conditions and enforce morality. But modern societies have invented an entirely new method of domination that requires little to no force. It operates by disseminating and reproducing moral values in every strata of society, such as the value of industriousness, the value of temperance, or the value of inclusivity and pluralism. Having internalized these values, people self-reproduce and socially enforce them. Today's enforcers are not necessarily the police, but rather teachers, doctors, managers, owners, and even your peers. Eventually, this becomes a kind of self-policing in which one measures one's conduct according to the internalized set of values, because deviating from them produces shame and the disapprobation of one's peers and supervisors. Just as with a literal panopticon, one feels as though one is being surveilled at all times, even when no one is watching. All the more reason to be quote-unquote upstanding. The average person feels as though he must rid himself of all problematic, discriminatory, or quote-unquote fascist beliefs to be a good person in the eyes of society. That is what ensnares him. The advertising industry operates like the panopticon. If the content of a website or product does not match their values, or the values of society writ large, then they will refuse to show ads on the website or for the product. The reason why is because social pressure and controversy decreases profitability. And so the panopticon and the incentives of capital combine to produce a regime of neocensorship, having nothing at all to do with the state. The same phenomenon occurs mutatis mutandis from payment processors and ISPs. I said something similar in my alt tech video, but I will give a deeper analysis of the causes of free market censorship. People are going to blame the left for this censorship. I don't even want to say the word, but people say this is an echo of a scandal from the past. However, I don't think the truth is that simple. Neocensorship is a phenomenon that will prove to transcend the binary of left and right. The reason for this is that it is fundamentally driven by market forces. We might ask a certain question about the rise of neocensorship. Isn't liberalism and its market supposed to be axiologically neutral? Why would capital become moralistic? Isn't morality an impediment to the creation of atomized consuming subjects? I think the reason for neocensorship actually paradoxically lies in the axiological neutrality. We cannot be so naive as to believe human beings can be truly morally neutral. As we know from a casual survey of political centrists, analogously, if the market is to remain values neutral, then it will have to have neutral values, or be radically centrist. In other words, values that are safe, values that reinforce the logic of reproduction of people or commodities, values that are fundamentally tepid and uncontroversial. Any values that deviate from the logic of the market cannot themselves be axiologically neutral. Any values that generate controversy cannot be axiologically neutral either. The only acceptable values are those that the market collective can accept without question. For this reason, games with extreme adult content cannot be commensurable with market ethics, despite the profit incentive merchants have to peddle such things to their respective audiences. Under liberalism, there is really no such thing as private consumption. What you consume defines who you are. It creates your identity. Your consumption is the sign by which others recognize you. As such, if you choose to consume in a way that violates market ethics or generates controversy, the market must restrain you somehow so as to preserve its own moral legitimacy, which is that it's claimed to be the best and most progressive system which produces the best people, or at least the least disastrous system that amounts to the same thing. We can plainly see that capital is adept at commodifying everything. It has commodified everything from sex to religion to politics. But there are limits to the degree that it can commodify morality. To do so would involve, ultimately, capitalism commodifying itself, turning capitalism into an exchange value, which in a literal sense is impossible. I'm not talking about the fountainhead. The market cannot sell itself, in the same sense as the liberal individual cannot alienate his own transcendent self. If the market has an ego, which I believe it does on a collective level, then it can have values, and the way to rise at those values is through a complex interplay of state power and infra power. From the top, the values of capital are determined by its conformity to law. From the bottom, the values of capital are determined by pressure from interest groups, popular majorities, and loud minorities. Combined, capitalism itself becomes the panopticon, the supreme and distributed enforcer of our values. Neoliberal economists like Hayek imagine that capitalism is values neutral, and any moral values are simply superimposed onto the quote-unquote spontaneous order, which constitutes socialist constructivism. No, the origin of morality under capitalism is not an alien force. It isn't even constructivism. It is instead the values inherent to the safe and stable reproduction of capital. If capital can better survive by throwing a few moral bones to conservatives and sexophobic liberals, then it will. If it can better survive by censoring the right or the radical left, then it will. All this is done in the name of avoiding controversy. It might even do both at the same time. It's true that the people themselves determine the parameters of controversy, and so in a sense, the morality is external. But simultaneously, the values that people hold are influenced by patterns of consumption and production, and so the morality is also internal. To put it elliptically, it is internally external. Is it not true that, paradoxically, capital likes us to imagine ourselves as sexless atoms who do not reproduce? That capital profits from the production of contraceptives. There is no place for sexual tension in the workplace, after all, and babies cut your productivity in half. But simultaneously, it is concerned with our reproduction, which is synonymous with its own reproduction. This is the reason why they have amplified the advertisement of sexuality and the production of sexual media, which, contrary to conservative belief, actually induces people to want to have sex. Capitalism is caught between two controversies: the controversy that sexuality is harmful, and the controversy that sexual repression is harmful. Capital, thus, now wants nothing more than to abdicate the task of distributing anything pro-sex or anti-sex. It is retreating into its shell to remain axiologically neutral. This will happen for everything else too. Violence, politics, debate, racism, sexism, even feminism and postmodernity. Anything that arouses controversy will be forbidden. Moral and expressive life under capitalism will resemble that of a public school. Any deviation away from the commonplace light of day, and thus from the non-controversial, will be forbidden. This crisis, the death of expression, can only be resolved by the end of liberal capitalism. The right won't get anywhere fighting the left because they are not the cause of this problem. Even if society were entirely quote-unquote right-wing, whatever that means, we would see the inevitable emergence of neo-censorship. And that is nothing to say of the right and the left that, for the sake of the preservation of society as a static unity, cheers on neo-censorship in the same sense that Robert Wolff and Marcuse applauded the idea of the repression of quote-unquote fascist views, but not of leftist views, in A Critique of Pure Tolerance. The principle that it's okay when we do it has been the justification for every unconscionable act of mass violence and oppression, such as that which is currently going on in Palestine. To protect the expression of values requires a change in values on this systemic scale. Society must be able to tolerate the controversial, to give a space to each element of society without devolving into individualistic or collectivist pluralism. It must be a project of integration, which, as Alain de Benoit wrote, begins with an emphasis on community. Community is a space of relative autonomy, a space insulated from the market, where what is produced is generally considered in terms of its use value. Since there is no concern about the profitability of a good, people are free to express, within the parameters and limits of the community in question, their values. This is what was meant in antiquity by liberty. Deviant values necessitate deviant communities. Conservative communities will express conservative values. All can be integrated into the whole. The liberal project of atomizing everyone, ironically turning the newly created individuals in question into a great faceless collective, as Evola wrote in Recognitions, is itself destructive to the personality and thus to autonomy. It destroys diversity. It destroys expression. It admits to no integration and thus can only be disintegrative or totalitarian, the final destinies of liberalism. Marxist socialism, the most individualist of all ideologies, cannot be the proper solution either. If socialism is to be an effective antidote, it must admit also to community and become opposed to all forms of pluralism. This is because liberation does not consist in destroying all values and eroding all barriers. It consists in belonging to a group that protects and enables your sphere of activity.